Testing, testing, one, two. Oh my goodness. Did I have it off the thing all this time? Oh no. Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. Oh, I've been doing this entire thing with muted. Not again. Oh. Horace, why didn't you warn me? What do you mean you thought it was funny? Come on, that's not fair. Right, well, I might as well continue. All right. Hello there, FT Waste. Welcome. Hello there, Private Maverick. Welcome, welcome. And hello there, Julian20. Welcome. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, we're up to a late start, it seems. Oh my goodness. Well, I might as well do my opening again. Hello, hello, hello. Greetings, salutations, konnichiwa, and every other form of green across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome back, my dear scholars, to the study. Oh my goodness. I hope everyone's doing well. And before I forget, what was I in the middle of? Yes, I would like to highlight our newest scholars to join our little group. Unfortunately, it seems like my newest scholars reader isn't working for some reason. But Silent Speaks VT, welcome to our group, and Legacy Bookish, welcome as well. I'm so happy to have you here. Every new scholar brings joy to my heart. I mean, I do this all for you. This is all done for your entertainment. But I'm so glad to have everyone here. Oh my goodness, are you all doing well? Julian20 tired. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Anyways, it was a tiring day, so gonna be taking it easy. Yes, you do that. You do that. It's always good to relax. And I hope our little stream here will help you relax. Somewhat. Julian20, looking forward to this story. That'll, well, um, it'll be interesting for sure. So, tonight's reading. Tonight we'll be reading the book, well, the novella, The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. And this book is what you might call proto-Lovecraftian. It's got aspects in it that are very similar to the Dunwich Horror, except this was written in 1890. And let me tell you, when it was written, it was critics were not great fans of it, to say the least. It was considered scandalous. Many critics thought it was deplorable for Victorian society, and that reading it would bring about, how do I put this? Reading it would bring about the worst degradation of morals that had ever occurred in humanity. Some going as far, excuse me for a moment, some going so far as to say that those who read this book would be driven mad by its contents. Well, I heard that little review and I thought, challenge accepted. FT Waste, it's horror. What do people expect? Well, at the time, this was horror unlike anything they had read. I mean, Victorian horror can get pretty gory and pretty dark, but this one, from what they believed, I'm certain it's not as bad as that. What they believed was a little bit beyond the pale. And I am going to attempt to read the entire novella tonight. It's only 7 chapters long. It's not very long from what I can tell, but I will be trying to read this entire thing in one sitting. We'll see how it goes. So, my dear scholars, are you ready to enter the strange world of the great god Pan? So, my dear scholars, then, if you are ready, FT Way spray it on. Alright, so if you're ready, sit back, relax, have a hot or cold beverage. If you wish, dim the lights, and we will begin our tale. The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. 1. The Experiment. I am glad you came, Clark. Very glad indeed. I was not sure you could spare the time. I was able to make arrangements for a few days. Things are not very lively just now. But have you no misgivings, Raymond? Is it absolutely safe? The two men were slowly pacing the terrace in front of Dr. Raymond's house. The sun still hung above the western mountain line, but it shone with a dull red glow that cast no shadows, and all the air was quiet. A sweet breath came from the great wood on the hillside above, and with it, at intervals, the soft murmuring call of the wild doves. Below, in the long, lovely valley, the river wound in and out between the lonely hills, and as the sun hovered and vanished into the west, a faint mist, pure white, began to rise from the hills. Dr. Raymond turned sharply to his friend. Safe? Of course it is. In itself, the operation is a perfectly simple one. Any surgeon could do it. And are they... yeah, and there's no danger at any other stage? None. Absolutely no physical danger whatsoever. I give you my word. You're always timid, Clark, always. But you know my history. I devoted myself to transcendental medicine for the last 20 years. I have heard myself called quack and charlatan and impostor, but all the while I knew I was on the right path. So we have here one of those fellows who are, and they thought I was mad, sort of guys. 5 years ago I reached the goal, and since then every day has been a preparation for what we shall do tonight. I would like to believe it is all true. Clark knit his brows and looked doubtfully at Dr. Raymond. Are you perfectly sure, Raymond, that your theory is not a phantasmagoria? A splendid vision, certainly, but a mere vision after all. Dr. Raymond stopped in his walk and turned sharply. He was a middle-aged man, gaunt and thin, of a pale yellow complexion. But he answered Clark and faced him. But as he answered Clark and faced him, there was a flush on his cheek. Look about you, Clark. You see the mountain and hill following after hill as wave on wave? You see the woods and orchard, and the fields of ripe corn, and the meadows reaching to the reed beds by the river. You see me standing here beside you, and hear my voice. But I tell you that all these things, yes, from that star that has just shone out in the sky to the solid ground beneath our feet, I say that all these are but dreams and shadows, the shadows that hide the real world from our eyes. There is a real world, but it's beyond this glamour and this vision, beyond these chases and auras, dreams and a career, beyond them all as beyond a veil. I do not know whether any human being has ever lifted that veil, but I do know, Clark, that you and I shall see it lifted this very night from before another's eyes. You may think this all strange nonsense. It may be strange, but it is true. And the ancients knew what lifting the veil means. They called it seeing the god Pan. Clark shivered. The white mist gathering over the river was chilly. "It is wonderful indeed," he said. "We are standing on the brink of a strange world, Raymond, if what you say is true. I suppose the knife is absolutely necessary?" "Yes, a slight lesion in the grey matter, that is all. A trifling rearrangement of certain cells. A microscopical alteration that would escape the attention of 99 brain specialists out of 100. I don't want to bother you with shop, Clark. I might give you a massive technical detail which would sound very imposing and would leave you as enlightened as you are now. But I suppose you have read casually in out-of-the-way corners of your paper that immense strides sorry, I'm tripping over my words. Have been made recently in the physiology of the brain. I saw a paragraph the other day about Digby's theory and Brown Faber's discoveries. Theories and discoveries. Where they are standing now I stood 15 years ago, and I need not tell you that I have not been standing still for the last 15 years. It will be enough if I say that 5 years ago I made the discovery that I alluded to when I said that 10 years ago I reached the goal. After years of labor, after years of toil and groping in the dark, after days and nights of disappointment and sometimes of despair, in which I used now and then to tremble and grow cold with a thought that perhaps there were others seeking for what I sought, at last, after so long, a pain of sudden joy thrilled my soul, and I knew the long journey was at an end. By what seemed then and still seems a chance, the suggestion of a moment's idle thought followed up upon familiar lines and paths that I had tracked 100 times already. The great truth burst upon me, and I saw mapped out in lines of sight a whole world, a sphere unknown, continents and islands and great oceans in which no ship had sailed, to my belief, since a man first lifted up his eyes and beheld the sun and the stars of heaven, and the quiet earth beneath. You will think this all high-flown language, Clark, but it is hard to be literal. And yet, I do not know whither what I am hinting at cannot be set forth in plain and lonely terms. For instance, this world of ours is pretty well girded now with the telegraph wires and cables. Thought with something less than the speed of thought flashes from sunrise to sunset, from north to south, across the floods and the desert plains. Suppose that an electrician of today was suddenly to perceive that he and his friends have merely been playing with pebbles, and mistaking them for the foundations of the world. Suppose that such a man saw uttermost space lie open before the current, and words of men flash forth to the sun and beyond the sun into the systems beyond, and the voice of articulate speaking men echo in the waste void that bounds our thought. As allegories go, that is a pretty good analogy of what I have done. You can understand now a little of what I felt as I stood here one evening. It was a summer evening, and this valley looked much as it does now. I stood here and saw before me the unutterable, the unthinkable gulf that yawns profound between two worlds, the world of matter and the world of spirit. I saw the great empty deep stretch dim before me, and in that instant a bridge of light leapt from the earth to the unknown shore, and the abyss was spanned. You may look in Brown Faber's book, if you like, and you will find that to the present day men of science are unable to account for the presence or to specify the functions of a certain group of nerve cells in the brain. That group is, as it were, land to let a mere waste place for fanciful theories. I am not in the position of Brown Faber and the specialists. I am perfectly instructed as to the possible functions of those nerve centers in the scheme of things. With a touch, I can bring them into play. With a touch, I say, I can set free the current. With a touch, I can complete the communication between this world of sense and... We shall be able to finish the sentence later on. Yes, the knife is necessary. But think what that knife will effect. It will level utterly the solid wall of sense and probability for the first time since man was made. A spirit will gaze on a spirit world. Clark! Mary will see the god Pan. Personally, I think he's a little crazy. Sorry, getting a little bit of a drink. Oh my goodness. It's fun to read crazy. But you remember what you wrote to me. I thought it would be requisite that she... He whispered the rest into the doctor's ear. Not at all, not at all. That is nonsense, I assure you. Indeed, it is better as it is. I am quite certain of that. Consider the matter well, Raymond. It's a great responsibility. Something might go wrong. You would be a miserable man for the rest of your days. No, I think not, even if the worst happened. As you know, I rescued Mary from the gutter, and from almost certain starvation when she was a child. I think her life is mine, to use as I fit. Okay, this guy is scum. This man is absolute scum. I'm sorry. He is a scumbag. Come, it's getting late. We had better go in. Dr. Raymond led the way into the house, through the hall and down a long dark passage. He took a key from his pocket and opened a heavy door and motioned Clark into his laboratory. It had once been a billiard room, and was lighted by a glass dome in the center of the ceiling, whence there still shone a sad gray light on the figure of the doctor as he lit a lamp with a heavy shade and placed it on a table in the middle of the room. Clark looked about him. Scarcely a foot of wall remained bare. There were shelves all around laden with bottles and phials of all shapes and colors, and at one end stood a little Chippendale bookcase. Raymond pointed to this. You see that parchment, Oswald Cornelius? He was one of the first to show me the way, though I don't think he ever found it himself. That is a strange saying of his. Excuse me. In every grain of wheat there lies hidden the soul of a star. FT tell us how you really feel. I could use stronger words than that. There was not much furniture in the laboratory. The table in the center, a stone slab with a drain in one corner, the two armchairs on which Raymond and Clark were sitting. That was all, except an odd-looking chair at the farthest end of the room. Clark looked at it and raised his eyebrow. Yes, that is the chair, said Raymond. We may as well place it in position. He got up and wheeled the chair to the light, and began raising and lowering it, letting down the seats, setting the back at various angles, and adjusting the footrest. It looked comfortable enough, and Clark passed his hand over the soft green velvet as the doctor manipulated the levers. Now, Clark, make yourself quite comfortable. I have a couple hours' work before me. I was obliged to leave certain matters to the last. Raymond went to the stone slab, and Clark watched him drearily as he bent over a row of phials and lit the flame under the crucible. The doctor had a small hand lamp, shaded as the larger one, on a ledge above his apparatus, and Clark, who sat in the shadows, looked down at the great shadowy room, wondering at the bizarre effects of brilliant light and undefined darkness contrasting with one another. Soon he became conscious of an odd odor, at first the mere suggestion of odor, in the room, and as it grew more decided, he felt surprised that he was not reminded of the chemist's shop or the surgery. Clark found himself idly endeavoring to analyze the sensation, and half-conscious, he began to think of a day, 15 years ago, that he had spent roaming through the woods and meadows near his own home. It was a burning day at the beginning of August. The heat had dimmed the outlines of all things and all distances with a faint mist, and people who observed the thermometer spoke of an abnormal register, of a temperature that was almost tropical. Strangely, that wonderful hot day of the 50s rose up again in Clark's imagination. The sense of dazzling, all pervading sunlight seemed to blot out the shadows and the lights of the laboratory, and he felt again the heated air beating in gusts about his face, saw the shimmer rising from the turf, and heard the myriad murmur of the summer. "I hope the smell doesn't annoy you, Clark. There's nothing unwholesome about it. It may make you a bit sleepy, that's all." Clark heard the words quite distinctly, and knew that Raymond was speaking to him. But for the life of him he could not rouse himself from lethargy. He could only think of the lonely walk he had taken 15 years ago. It was his last look at the fields and woods he had known since he was a child, and now it all stood out in brilliant light as a picture before him. Above all there came to his nostrils the scent of summer, the smell of flowers mingled and the odor of the woods, of cool shaded places deep in the green depths drawn forth by the sun's heat, and the scent of the good earth, lying as it were with arms stretched forth and smiling lips, overpowered all. His fancies made him wander as he had wandered long ago, from the fields into the wood, tracking a little path between the shining undergrowth of beech trees, and the trickle of water dropping from the limestone rocks sounded as a clear melody in the dream. Thoughts began to go astray, and to mingle with other thoughts. The beech alley was transformed to a path between ilex trees. Not sure what an ilex tree is. And here and there a vine climbed from bough to bough, and sent up waving tendrils and drooped with purple grapes, and the sparse gray-green leaves of a wild olive tree stood out against the dark shadows of the ilex. Clark, in the deep folds of dream, was conscious that the path from his father's house had led him into an undiscovered country, and he was wondering at the strangeness of it all, when suddenly, in place of the hum and murmur of the summer, an infinite silence seemed to fall on all things, and the wood was hushed, and for a moment in time he stood face to face, there with a presence that was neither man nor beast, neither the living nor the dead, but all things mingled, the form of all things, but devoid of all form. FT Wastes, is that spelled? Yes, that is how it's spelled. FT Wastes. Hold on a second. But all things mingled, the form of all things, but devoid of all form. And in that moment the sacrament of body and soul was dissolved, and a voice seemed to cry, "Let us go hence." And then the darkness of darkness beyond the stars, the darkness of everlasting. FT Waste is a kind of evergreen oak tree. First time I've ever heard of it. First time I've ever heard of it as well. When Clark woke up from a start, he saw Raymond pouring a few drops of some oily fluid into a green vial, which he stoppered tightly. FT Wastes from the Mediterranean. That makes perfect sense if you know where Pan originates. "You've been dozing," he said. "The journey must have tired you out. It is done now. I am going to fetch Mary. I shall be back in 10 minutes." Clark lay back in his chair and wondered. It seemed as if he had passed from one dream into another. He half expected to see the walls of the laboratory melt and disappear, and to awake in London, shuddering at his own sleeping fancies. But at last the door opened, and the doctor returned, and behind him came a girl of about 17, dressed all in white. She was so beautiful that Clark did not wonder at what the doctor had written to him. She was blushing now over face and neck and arms, but Raymond seemed unmoved. "Mary," he said, "the time has come. You are quite free. Are you willing to trust yourself to me entirely?" Yes, dear. Do you hear that, Clark? You are my witness. Here's the chair, Mary. It is quite easy. Just sit in it and lean back. Are you ready? Yes, dear, quite ready. Give me a kiss before you begin. Ugh. The doctor stooped and kissed her mouth kindly enough. He raised this girl as a child. I mean, okay, what? Now shut your eyes, he said. The girl closed her eyelids as if she were tired and longed for sleep, and Raymond placed the green phial to her nostrils. Her face grew white, whiter than her dress. She struggled faintly, and then with the feeling of submission strong within her, crossed her arms upon her breast as a little child about to say her prayers. Sorry. The bright light of the lamp fell full upon her, and Clark watched changes fleeting over her face, as the changes of the hills when the summer clouds float across the sun. Then she lay all white and still, and the doctor turned up one of her eyelids. She was quite unconscious. Raymond pressed hard on one of the levers, and the chair instantly sank back. Clark saw him cutting away a circle, like a tonsure, from her hair, and the lamp was moved nearer. Raymond took a small, glittering instrument from a little case, and Clark turned away, shudderingly. When he looked again, the doctor was binding up the wound he had made. She will awake in 5 minutes. Raymond was still perfectly cool. There's nothing more to be done. We can only wait. The minutes passed slowly. They could hear a slow, heavy ticking. There was an old clock in the passage. Clark felt sick and faint. His knees shook beneath him. He could hardly stand. Suddenly, as they watched, they heard a long-drawn sigh, and suddenly did the color that had vanished return to the girl's cheeks, and suddenly her eyes opened. Clark quailed before them. They shone with an awful light. Looking far away, and a great wonder fell upon her face, and her hands stretched out as if to touch what was invisible. But in an instant the wonder faded, and gave place to the most awful terror. The muscles of her face were hideously convulsed. She shook from head to foot. The soul seemed struggling and shuddering within the house of flesh. It was a horrible sight, and Clark rushed forward as she fell shrieking to the floor. 3 days later, Raymond took Clark to Mary's bedside. She was lying wide awake, rolling her head from side to side, and grinning vacantly. Yes, said the doctor, still quite cool. It is a great pity. She is a hopeless idiot. However, it could not be helped. And after all, she has seen the great god Pan. I still say this Raymond guy is scum. Doing that sort of thing. You know she didn't do it of her own free will. Sorry. 2. Mr. Clark's Memoirs. Mr. Clark, the gentleman chosen by Dr. Raymond to witness the strange experiment of the god Pan, was a person in whose character caution and curiosity were oddly mingled. In his sober moments he thought of the unusual and the eccentric with undisguised aversion, and yet deep in his heart there was a wide-eyed inquisitiveness with respect to all the more recondite and esoteric elements in the nature of men. The latter tendency had prevailed when he accepted Raymond's invitation, for though he considered judgment had always been reputed for though his considered judgment had always reputed the doctor's theories as the wildest nonsense, Yet he secretly hugged a belief in fantasy and would have rejoiced to see that belief confirmed. The horrors that he witnessed in the dreary laboratory were to a certain extent salutary. He was conscious of being involved in an affair not altogether reputable, and for many years afterwards he clung bravely to the commonplace, and rejected all occasions of occult investigation. Indeed, on some homeopathic principle, I hope I pronounced that right, homeopathic principle, he for some time attended the seances of distinguished mediums, hoping that the clumsy tricks of these gentlemen would make him altogether disgusted with mysticism of every kind. But the remedy, though caustic, was not efficacious. Clark knew that he still pined for the unseen, and little by little the old passion began to reassert itself, as the face of Mary, shuddering and convulsed with an unknown terror, faded slowly from his memory. Occupied all day in pursuits both serious and lucrative, the temptation to relax in the evening was too great, especially in the winter months, when the fire casts a warm glow over his smug bachelor apartment, and a bottle of some choice claret stood ready by his elbow. His dinner digested, he would make a brief pretense of reading the evening paper, but the mere catalogue of news soon palled upon him, and Clark would find himself casting glances of warm desire in the direction of an old Japanese bureau, which stood at a pleasant distance from the hearth. Like a boy before a jam closet, for a few minutes he would hover indecisive, but lust always prevailed, and Clark ended by drawing up his chair, lighting a candle, and sitting down before the bureau. Its pigeonholes and drawers teemed with documents on the most morbid subjects, and in the well reposed a large manuscript volume in which he had painfully entered the gems of his collection. Clark had a fine contempt for published literature. The most ghostly stories ceased to interest him if it happened to be printed. His sole pleasure was in the reading, compiling and rearranging what he called his memoirs to prove the existence of the devil, and engaged in this pursuit, the evening seemed to fly, and the night appeared too short. On one particular evening, an ugly December night, black with fog and raw with frost, Clark hurried over his dinner, and scarcely deigned to observe his customary ritual of taking up the paper and laying it down again. He paced 2 or 3 times up and down the room, and opened the bureau, stood still a moment, and sat down. He leant back, absorbed in one of those dreams to which he was subject, and at length drew out his book and opened it at the last entry. There were 3 or 4 pages, densely covered with Clark's round, set penmanship, and at the beginning he had written in a somewhat larger hand, "Singular narrative told me by my friend Dr. Phillips. He assures me that all the facts related therein are strictly and wholly true, but refuses to give either the surnames of the persons concerned or the place where these extraordinary events occurred." Mr. Clark began to read over the account for the 10th time, glancing now and then at the pencil notes he had made, when it was told him by his friend. It was one of his humors to pride himself on a certain literary ability. He thought well of his style, and took pains in arranging the circumstances in dramatic order. He read the following story. The persons concerned in this statement are Helen V., who, if she is still alive, must now be a woman of 23. Richard M., since deceased, who was a year younger than the above, and Trevor W., an imbecile, aged 18. Oh, that's not a nice thing to say. These persons were at the period of the story inhabitants of a village on the border of Wales, a place of some importance in the time of the Roman occupation, but now a scattered hamlet of not more than 500 souls. It is situated on rising ground about 6 miles from the sea, and is sheltered by a large and picturesque forest. Some 11 years ago Helen V. came to the village under rather particular circumstances. It is understood that she, being an orphan, was adopted in her infancy by a distant relative, who brought her up in his own house until she was 12 years old. Thinking, however, that it would be better for the child to have a playmate of her own age, he advertised in several local papers for a good home in a comfortable farmhouse for a girl of 12, and this advertisement was answered by Mr. R., a well-to-do farmer in the above-mentioned village. His references proving satisfactorily, the gentleman sent his adopted daughter to Mr. R. with a letter in which he stipulated that the girl should have a room to herself, and stated that her guardians need be at no trouble in the matter of education, as she was already sufficiently educated for the position in life which she would occupy. In fact, Mr. R. was given to understand that the girl be allowed to find her own occupations, and to spend her time almost as she liked. Mr. R. duly met her at the nearest station, a town 7 miles from his house, and seemed to have remarked nothing extraordinary about the child, except that she was reticent as to her former life and her adopted father. She was, however, of a very different type from the inhabitants of the village. Her, her skin was a pale, clear olive, and her features were strongly marked, and of a somewhat foreign character. She appears to have settled down easily enough into the farmhouse life, and became a favorite with the children, who sometimes went with her on her rambles in the forest, for this was her amusement. Mr. R. states that has known her to go out by herself directly after their early breakfast, and not return till after dusk, and that, feeling uneasy at a young girl being out alone for so many hours, he communicated with her adopted father, who replied in a brief note that Helen must do as she chose. In the winter, when the forest paths are impassable, she spent most of her time in her bedroom, where she slept alone, according to the instructions of her relative. It was on one of these expeditions to the forest that the first of the singular incidences with which this girl is connected occurred, the date being about a year after her arrival in the village. The preceding winter had been remarkably severe, the snow drifting to a great depth, and the frost continuing for an unexampled period, and the summer following was as noteworthy for its extreme heat. On one of the very hottest days in this summer, Helen V. left the farmhouse for one of her long rambles in the forest, taking with her, as usual, some bread and meat for lunch. She was seen by some men in the field making for the old Roman road, a green causeway which traverses the highest part of the wood, and they were astonished to observe that the girl had taken off her hat, though that the heat of the sun was already tropical. I wouldn't think that'd be too weird. I mean, maybe she doesn't like wearing the hat. Excuse me. As it happened, a laborer, Joseph W. by name, was working in the forest near the Roman road, and at 12 o'clock his little son Trevor brought the man his dinner of bread and cheese. After the meal, the boy, who was about 7 years old at the time, left his father at work, and, as he said, went to look for flowers in the wood, and the man, who could hear him shouting with delight at his discoveries, felt no uneasiness. Excuse me. Suddenly, however, he was horrified at hearing the most dreadful screams, evidently the result of great terror, proceeding from the direction in which his son had gone, and he hastily threw down his tools and ran to see what had happened. Tracing his path by the sound, he met the little boy, who was running headlong and was evidently terribly frightened, and on questioning him, the man elicited that after picking a posy of flowers he felt tired, and lay down on the grass and fell asleep. He was suddenly awakened, as he stated, by a peculiar noise, a sort of singing he called, and on peeping through the branches, he saw Helen V. playing on the grass with a strange, naked man, who he seemed unable to describe more fully. He said he felt dreadfully frightened and ran away crying for his father. Joseph W. proceeded in the direction indicated by his son and found Helen V. sitting on the grass in the middle of a glade or open space left by charcoal burners. He angrily charged her with frightening his little boy, but she entirely denied the accusation, and laughed at the child's story of a strange man, to which he himself did not attach much credence. Joseph W. came to the conclusion that the boy had woke up with a sudden fright, as children sometimes do. But Trevor persisted in his story, and continued in such evident distress that at last his father took him home, hoping that his mother would be able to soothe him. For many weeks, however, the boy gave his parents much anxiety. He became nervous and strange in his manner, refusing to leave the cottage by himself, and constantly alarming the household by waking in the night with cries of, "The man in the wood! Father! Father!" In course of time, however, the impression seemed to have worn off, and about 3 months later he accompanied his father to the home of a gentleman in the neighborhood, for whom Joseph W. occasionally did work. The man was shown into the study, and the little boy was left sitting in the hall. And a few minutes later, while the gentleman was giving W. his instructions, they were both horrified by a piercing shriek and the sound of a fall, and rushing out they found the child lying senseless on the floor, his face contorted with terror. The doctor was immediately summoned, and after some examination he pronounced the child to be suffering from a kind of fit, apparently produced by a sudden shock. The boy was taken to one of the bedrooms, and after some time recovered consciousness, but only to pass into a condition described by the medical man as one of violent hysteria. The doctor exhibited a strong sedative, and in the course of 2 hours pronounced him fit to walk home, but in passing through the hall the paroxysms of fright returned, and with additional violence. The father perceived that the child was pointing at some object, and heard the old cry, "The man in the wood!" and looking in the direction indicated saw a stone head of grotesque appearance, which had been built into the wall above one of the doors. It seemed the owner of the house had recently made alterations in his premises, and on digging the foundations for some offices, the men had found a curious head, evidently of the Roman period, which had been placed in the manner described. The head is pronounced by the most experienced archaeologists of the district to be that of a faun or satyr. Dr. Phillips tells me that he has seen the head in question, and assures me that he has never received such a vivid presentiment of intense evil. For whatever cause arising, this second shock seemed too severe for the boy Trevor, and at the present date he suffers from a weakness of intellect, which gives but little promise of amending. The matter caused a good deal of sensation at the time, and the girl Helen was closely questioned by Mr. R., but to no purpose, she steadfastly denying that she had frightened or in any way molested Trevor. The second event with which this girl's name is connected took place about 6 years ago, and is of a still more extraordinary character. At the beginning of the summer of 1882, Helen contracted a friendship of a particularly intimate character with Rachel M., the daughter of a prosperous farmer in the neighborhood. This girl, who was a year younger than Helen, was considered by most people to be the prettier of the two, though Helen's features had to a great extent softened as she became older. The two girls, who were together on every available opportunity, presented a singular contrast. The one with her clear olive skin and almost Italian appearance, and the other of the proverbial red and white of our rural districts. It must be stated that the payments made to Mr. R. for the maintenance of Helen were known in the village for their excessive liberality, and the impression was general that she would one day inherit a large sum of money from a relative. The parents of Rachel were therefore not averse from their daughter's friendship with the girl, and even encouraged the intimacy, though they now bitterly regret having done so. Helen still retained her extraordinary fondness for the forest, and on several occasions Rachel accompanied her, the two friends setting out early in the morning and remaining in the wood until dusk. Once or twice after these excursions, Mrs. M thought her daughter's manner rather peculiar. She seemed languid and dreamy, and excuse me, it has been expressed different from herself. But these peculiarities seem to have been thought too trifling for remark. One evening, however, after Rachel had come home, her mother heard a noise which sounded like suppressed weeping in the girl's room, and on going in found her lying half undressed upon the bed, evidently in the greatest distress. As soon as she saw her mother, she exclaimed, "Ah, mother, mother, why did you let me go to the forest with Helen?" Mrs. M was astonished at so strange a question, and proceeded to make inquiries. Rachel told her a wild story. She said, Clark closed the book with a snap and turned his chair towards the fire. When his friend sat one evening in that very chair and told his story, Clark had interrupted him at a point a little subsequent to this, had cut short his words in a paroxysm of horror. "My God!" he exclaimed. Think what you are saying. It's too incredible, too monstrous. Such things can never be in this quiet world, where men and women live and die, and struggle and conquer, or maybe fall down under sorrow, and grieve and suffer strange fortunes for many a year. But not this, Phillips. Not such things as this. There must be some explanation, some way out of the terror. Why, man, if such a case were possible, Earth would be a nightmare. But Phillips had told his story to the end, concluding, "Her flight remains a mystery to this day. She vanished in broad sunlight. They saw her walking in a meadow, and a few moments later she was not there." Clark tried to conceive the thing again as he sat by the fire, and again his mind shuddered and shrank back, appalled before the sight of such awful, unspeakable elements enthroned, as it were, and triumphant in human flesh. We can probably guess what happened in the forest, my dear scholars. The author does something very smart by not telling us directly, but his readers would probably guess what happened. Before him stretched the long dim vista of the Before him stretched the long dim vista of the green causeway in the forest, as his friend had described it. He saw the swaying leaves and the quivering shadows on the grass. He saw the sunlight on the flowers, and far away, far in the long distance, the two figures moved toward him. One was Rachel, but the other. Clark had tried his best to disbelieve it all, but at the end of the account, as he had written it in his book, he had placed the inscription, "Et diabolus incarnate est, et homo factus est." You know, oddly enough, I don't speak Latin, so if anyone knows Latin and can translate that, yeah, it'd be much appreciated. Excuse me. Sorry. 3. The City of Resurrections. "Herbert! Good God, is it possible?" "Yes, my name's Herbert. I think I know your face too, but I don't remember your name. My memory is very queer." Don't you recollect Villas of Wadham?" "So it is. So it is. I beg your pardon, Villas. I didn't think I was begging of an old college friend. Good night." "My dear fellow, this haste is unnecessary. My rooms are close by, but we won't go there just yet. Suppose we walk up Shaftesbury Bury Avenue a little way. But how in heaven's name have you come to this pass, Herbert? It's a long story, Villars, and a strange one, too. But you can hear it if you like. Come on, then, take my arm. You don't seem very strong. The ill-assorted pair moved slowly up Rupert Street, the one in dirty, evil-looking rags, and the other attired in the regulation uniform of a man about town, trim, glossy, and evidently well-to-do. Villars had emerged from his restaurant after an excellent dinner of many courses, assisted by an integrating little flask of Chianti, and in that frame of mind which was with him almost chronic, had delayed a moment by the door, peering round in the dimly lit street in search of those mysterious incidences and persons with which the streets of London teem in every quarter and every hour. Villars prided himself as a practised explorer of such obscure mazes and byways of London life, and in this unprofitable pursue, he displayed an assiduity which was worthy of more serious employment. Thus he stood by the lamp-post surveying the passer-by with undisguised curiosity, and with that gravity known only to the systematic diner, had just enunciated in his mind the formula, "London has been called the city of encounters. It is more that it is the city of resurrections," when these reflections were suddenly interrupted by a piteous whine at his elbow, and a deplorable appeal for alms. He looked around in some irritation, and with a sudden shock found himself confronted with the embodied proof of his somewhat stilted fancies. There, close beside him, his face altered and disfigured by poverty and disgrace, his body barely covered by greasy, ill-fitting rags, stood his old friend Charles Herbert, who had matriculated on the same day as himself, with married, they mean married, who matriculated on the same day as himself, and with whom he had been merry and wise for 12 revolving terms. Different occupations and varying interests had interrupted the friendship, and it was 6 years since Villars had seen Herbert, and now he looked upon this wreck of a man with grief and dismay, mingled with a certain inquisitiveness as to what dreary chain of circumstances had dragged him down to such a doleful pass. Villars felt together with compassion all the relish of the amateur in mysteries, and congratulated himself on his leisurely speculations outside the restaurant. They walked on in silence for some time, and more than one passer-by stared in astonishment at the unaccustomed spectacle of a well-dressed man with an unmistakable beggar hanging on to his arms, and observing this, Villars led the way to an obscure street in Soho. Here he repeated his question. "How on earth has it happened, Herbert? I always understood you would succeed to an excellent position in Dorsetshire. Did your father disinherit you? Surely not." "No, Villars. I came into all the property at my poor father's death. He died a year after I left Oxford. He was a very good father to me, and I mourned his death sincerely enough. But you know what young men are. A few months later I came up to town, and went a good deal into society. Of course I had excellent introductions, and I managed to enjoy myself very much in a harmless sort of way. I played a little, certainly, but never for heavy stakes. The few bets I made on races brought me in money. Only a few pounds, you know, but enough to pay for cigars and such petty pleasures." Oh, he didn't. It wasn't marriage. That's not what that word meant. Oh my goodness, my mistake. "It was in my second season that the tide turned. Of course you have heard of my marriage?" "No, I never heard anything about it." "Yes, I married, Villars. I met a girl of the most wonderful and most strange beauty, at the house of some people whom I knew. I cannot tell you her age. I never knew it. So far as I can guess, I should think she must have been about 19 when I made her acquaintance. My friends had come to know her at Florence. She told them she was an orphan, the child of an English father and an Italian mother, and she charmed them as she charmed me. The first time I saw her was at an evening party. I was standing by the door talking to a friend when suddenly above the hum and babbles of conversation I heard a voice which seemed to thrall to my heart. She was singing an Italian song. I was introduced to her that evening, and in 3 months I married Helen. Helen? Oh, there's the link. Phyllis, that woman, if I can call her woman, corrupted my soul. The night of the wedding, I found myself sitting in her bedroom in the hotel listening to her talk. She was sitting up in bed, and I listened to her as she spoke in her beautiful voice, spoke of things which even now I would not dare whisper in the blackest nights, though I stood in the midst of a wilderness. You villas, you may think you know life in London and what goes on day and night in this dreadful city. For all I can say, you may have heard the talk of the vilest, but I tell you, you can have no conception of what I know. Not in your most fantastic, hideous dreams can you ever imagine forth the faintest shadow of what I have heard and seen. Yes, seen. I have seen the incredible, such horrors that even I myself sometimes stop in the middle of the street and ask whether it is possible for a man to behold such things and live. In a year, Villas, I was a ruined man, in body and in soul. But your property, Herbert. You had land in Dorset. I sold it all. The fields and woods, the dear old house, everything. And the money. She took it all from me. And then left you. Yes. She disappeared one night. I don't know where she went, but I am sure if I saw her again it would kill me. The rest of my story is of no interest. Sordid misery, that is all. You may think, Villas, that I have exaggerated and talked for effect, but I have not told you half. I could tell you certain things which would convince you, but you would never know a happy day again. You would pass the rest of your life as I passed mine, a haunted man, a man who has seen hell. Villars took the unfortunate man to his room and gave him a meal. Herbert could eat little and scarcely touch the glass of wine set before him. He sat moody and silent by the fire and seemed relieved when Villars sent him away with a small present of money. "By the way, Herbert," said Villars as they parted at the door, "what was your wife's name? You said Helen, I think. Helen what?" "The name she passed under when I met her was Helen Vaughan, but what her real name was I can't say. I don't think she had a name. No, not in that sense. Only human beings have names, Villas. I can't say any more. Goodbye. Yes, I will not fail to call if I see any way in which you can help me. Good night." The man went out into the bitter night, and Villars returned to his fireside. "Oh, hello there, Assail. Welcome, and thank you for the hydrate." Thank you. Julian20, only human beings? Yes, apparently only human beings. We are in the middle of reading The Great God Pan, and things are getting really strange. Excuse me. There was something about Herbert which shocked him inexpressibly. Not his poor rags, nor the marks which poverty had set upon his face. Say, "Oh, I'm here to lurk." Oh, that's fine. Feel free to lurk. I have no problem with that. I'm just glad to have you here. Oh, thank you for the raid, Lorelei. Welcome, and welcome, raiders. Hello, hello, hello. Oh my goodness. Thank you for the raid. Can I do a shout out? Okay. Let's shout out. There you go. Thank you, thank you. This is my awakened form. Yes. Hello Raiders, I am Matsu Quinox, interdimensional omniversal librarian. I do reading streams and gaming streams and all sorts of streams. And There is, and here's Horace. He is my companion, friend, assistant, and all other manner of things. Paramag, I should put away the tar and feather. And, dear Raiders, we are reading The Great God Pan, which is a classic horror tale, proto-Lovecraftian. And we are in the middle. We are about a little bit, not so much in the middle, but mysterious things are happening revolving around a young woman, Helen Vaughn. Already we've learned that she did something to this one young woman, and that she's driven this one man to ruin. Oh, Lorelai, wait till you see this story. Blah blah. Horace loves you too. Lorelai, my great great great. Oh, you're. This will be interesting. This gets weird. Oh, hello, hello, Raiders. Hello, blah blah. Hello, Lorelai. Hello, Old Owls Gaming. Hello, hello, hello. Where? Oh, I hit the wrong thing. Okay, where were we? There was something about Herbert which shocked him inexpressibly. Not his poor rags, nor the marks which poverty had set upon his face, but rather an indefinite terror which hung about him like a mist. He had acknowledged that he himself was not devoid of blame. The woman, he had avowed, had corrupted him body and soul, and Villars felt that this man, once his friend, had been an actor in scenes evil beyond the power of words. His story needed no confirmation. He himself was the embodied proof of it. Yes, hello there. Oh, thank you for the follow, old Oz Gaming. Thank you, and welcome to our wonderful little group of scholars. Apparently, you weren't following me. Well, I'm glad for the follow. Villars mused curiously over the story he had heard, and wondered whether he had heard both the first and the last of it. No, he thought, certainly not the last. Probably only the beginning. A case like this is like a nest of Chinese boxes. You open one after the other and find a quainter workmanship in every box. Most likely poor Herbert is merely one of the outside boxes. There are stranger ones to follow. Villars could not take his mind away from Herbert and his story, which seemed to grow wilder as the night wore on. The fire seemed to burn low, and the chilly air of the morning crept into the room. Villars got up with a glance over his shoulder, and shivering slightly went to bed. A few days later he saw at his club a gentleman of his acquaintance named Austin, who was famous for his intimate knowledge of London life, both in its tenebrious and luminous phases. Villars, still full of his encounter in Soho and its consequences, thought Austin might possibly be able to shed some light on Herbert's history, and so after some casual talk he suddenly put the question. "Do you happen to know anything of a man named Herbert? Charles Herbert?" Austin turned round sharply and stared at Villars with some astonishment. "Charles Herbert? Weren't you in town 3 years ago? No. Then you have not heard of the Paul Street case. It caused a good deal of sensation at the time." "What was the case?" "Well, a gentleman, a man of very good position, was found dead. Stark dead in the area of a certain house at Paul Street, off Tottenham Court Road. Of course, the police did not make the discovery. If you happen to be sitting up all night and have a light in your window, the constable will ring the bell. But if you happen to be lying dead in somebody's area, you will be left alone. In this instance, as in many others, the alarm was raised by some kind of vagabond. I don't mean a common tramp or a public-house loafer, but a gentleman, whose business or pleasure or both made him a spectator of London streets at 5 o'clock in the morning. This individual was, as he said, going home. It did not appear whence or whither, and had occasion to pass through Paul Street between 4 and 5 a.m. Something or other caught his eye. At number 20, he said absurdly enough that the house had the most unpleasant physiognomy he had ever observed. But at any rate he glanced down the area, and was a good deal astonished to see a man lying on the stones. his limbs all huddled together and his face turned up. Our gentleman thought his face looked particularly ghastly, and so set off at a run in search of the nearest policeman. The constable was at first inclined to treat the matter lightly, suspecting common drunkenness. However, he came, and after looking at the man's face, changed his tone quickly enough. The early bird who had picked up this fine worm was sent off for a doctor, and the policeman rang and knocked at the door till a slattery servant girl came down looking more than half asleep. The constable pointed out the contents of the area to the maid, who screamed loudly enough to wake up the street. But she knew nothing of the man, and had never seen him in the house, and so forth. Meanwhile, the original discoverer had come back with a medical man, and the next thing was to get into the area. The gate was open, so the whole quartet stumped down the steps. The doctor hardly needed a moment's examination. He said the poor fellow had been dead for several hours, and it was then the case began to get interesting. The dead man had not been robbed, and in one of his pockets was papers identifying him as a man of good family and means, a favorite in society, and nobody's enemy, as far as could be known. I don't give his name, Villers, because it has nothing to do with the story, and because it's no good raking up these affairs about the dead when there are no relations living. The next curious point was that the medical man couldn't agree as how he met his death. There were some slight bruises on his shoulder, but they were so slight that it looked as if he had been pushed roughly out of the kitchen door, and not thrown over the railings from the street or even dragged down the steps. But there were positively no other marks of violence about him, and certainly none that would account for his death. And when they came to the autopsy, there wasn't a trace of poison of any kind. Of course, the police wanted to know all about the people at number 20, and here again, so I have heard from private sources, one or two other very curious points came out. It appears that the occupants of the house were a Mr. and Mrs. Charles Herbert. He was said to be a landed proprietor, though it struck most people that Paul Street was not exactly the place to look for country gentry. As for Mrs. Herbert, nobody seemed to know who or what she was, and between ourselves I fancy the divers after her history found themselves in rather strange waters. Of course, they both denied knowing anything about the deceased, and in default of any evidence against them, they were discharged. But some very odd things came out about them. Though it was between 5 and 6 in the morning when the dead man was removed, a large crowd had collected, and several of the neighbors ran to see what was going on. They were pretty free with their comments, by all accounts, and from these it appeared that number 20 was in very bad odor in Paul Street. The detectives tried to trace down these rumors to some solid foundation of fact, but could not get hold of anything. People shook their heads and raised their eyebrows and thought the Herberts rather queer, would rather not be seen going to their house, and so on. But there was nothing tangible. The authorities were morally certain the man met his death in some way or another in the house and was thrown out by the kitchen door, but they couldn't prove it, and the absence of any indications of violence or poisoning left them helpless. An odd case, wasn't it? But curiously enough, there's something more that I haven't told you. I happen to know one of the doctors who was consulted as to the cause of the death, and some time after the inquest I met him, and asked him about it. "Do you really mean to tell me," I said, "that you are baffled by the case, that you actually don't know what the man died of?" "Pardon me," he replied, "I know perfectly well what caused death. Blake died of fright, of sheer awful terror. I never saw features so hideously contorted in the entire course of my practice, and I have seen the faces of a whole host of dead." The doctor was usually a cool customer enough, and a certain vehemence in his manner struck me, but I couldn't get anything more out of him. I suppose the Treasury didn't see their way to prosecuting the Herberts for frightening a man to death. At any rate, nothing was done, and the case was dropped out of men's minds. Do you happen to know anything of Herbert? "Well," replied Villers, "he was an old college friend of mine." "You don't say so. Have you ever seen his wife?" "No, I haven't. I have lost sight of Herbert for many years." "It's queer, isn't it? Parting with a man at the college gate who at Paddington, seen nothing of him for years, and then finding him pop up his head in such an odd place. But I should like to have seen Mrs. Herbert. People said extraordinary things about her." What sort of things? Well, I hardly know how to tell you. Everyone who saw her at the police court said she was at once the most beautiful woman and the most repulsive they had ever set their eyes on. I spoken to a man who saw her, and I assure you he positively shuddered as he tried to describe the woman, but he couldn't tell why. She seemed to have been a sort of enigma, and I expect if that one dead man could have told tales, he would have told some uncommonly queer ones. And then you are again in another puzzle. What could a respectable country gentleman like Mr. Blank, we'll call him that if you don't mind, want in such a very queer house as number 20? It's altogether a very odd case, isn't it? It is indeed, Austin. An extraordinary case. I didn't think, when I asked you about my old friend, I should strike on such a strange metal. Well, I must be off. Good day. Villas went away, thinking of his own conceit of the Chinese boxes. Here was quaint workmanship, indeed. Another drink. 4. The Discovery in Paul Street. This is really getting a little bit spooky. A few months after Villar's meeting with Herbert, Mr. Clark was sitting as usual by his after-dinner by his. I am tripping over my words terribly tonight. Sorry, scholars. Mr. Clark was sitting as usual by his after-dinner hearth, resolutely guarding his fancies from wandering in the direction of the Borough. For more than a week he had succeeded in keeping away from the memoirs, and he cherished hopes of a complete self-reformation. But in spite of his endeavors, he could not hush the wonder and the strange curiosity that the last case he had written down had excited within him. He had put the case, or rather the outline of it, conjecturally to a scientific friend, who shook his head and thought Clark getting queer, and on this particular evening Clark was making an effort to rationalize the story, when a sudden knock at the door roused him from his meditations. "Mr. Villiers to see you, sir." "Dear me, Villiers! Dear me, Villiers! It is very kind of you to look me up. I have not seen you for many months. I should think nearly a year. Come in, come in. And how are you, Villiers? Want any advice about investments?" "No, thanks. I fancy everything I have in that way is pretty safe. No, Clark. I have really come to consult you about a rather curious matter that has been brought under my notice of late. I am afraid you will think it all rather absurd when I tell my tale. I sometimes think so myself. That's just what I made up my mind to come to you, as I know you're a practical man." Mr. Villiers was ignorant of the memoirs to prove the existence of the devil. Excuse me. "Well, Villiers, I shall be happy to give you my advice, to the best of my ability. What is the nature of the case?" "It's an extraordinary thing altogether. You know my ways. I always keep my eyes open in the streets, and in my times I have chanced upon some queer customers, and queer cases too. But this, I think, beats all. I was coming out of a restaurant one nasty winter night about 3 months ago. I had a capital dinner and a good bottle of Chianti, and stood for a moment on the pavement, thinking what a mystery there is about London streets and the companies that pass along them. A bottle of red wine encourages these fancies, Clark, and I dare say I should have thought a page of small type. But I was cut short by a beggar who had come behind me, and was making the usual appeals. Of course I looked around, and this beggar turned out to be what was left an old friend of mine, a man named Herbert. I asked him how he had come to such a wretched pass, and he told me. We walked up and down one of those long and dark Soho streets, and there I listened to his story. He said he had married a beautiful girl some years younger than himself, and as he put it, she had corrupted him, body and soul. He wouldn't go into details. He said he dared not. That what he had seen and heard haunted him by night and day. And I looked in his, and when I looked in his face, I knew he was speaking the truth. There was something about the man that made me shiver. I don't know why, but it was there. I gave him a little money and sent him away. I assure you that when he was gone I gasped for breath. His presence seemed to chill one's blood. Isn't this just a little fanciful, Villers? I suppose the old poor fellow had made an impertinent marriage, and in plain English gone to the bad. Well, listen to this. Villers told Clark the story. Yeah, Villers told Clark the. I'm awful, sorry. Villers told Clark the story he had heard from Austin. You see, he concluded, there can be but little doubt that this Mr. Blank, whoever he was, died of sheer terror. He saw something so awful, so terrible, that it cut short his life. And what he saw, he most certainly saw in the house, which somehow or other had got a bad name in the neighborhood. I had the curiosity to go and look at the place for myself. It's a saddening kind of street. The houses are old enough to be mean and dreary, but not old enough to be quaint. Well, congratulations on getting first FT waste, and thank you for the hydrate. Yes, I don't think anyone got the first this time. Had the curiosity to go and look at the place for myself. It's a saddened kind of street. The houses are old enough to be mean and dreary, but not old enough to be quaint. As far as I could see, most of them are let in lodgings, and furnished and unfurnished, and almost every door has 3 bells to it. Here and there the ground floors have been made into shops of the commonest kind. It's a dismal street in every way. I found number 20 was to let, and went to the agents and got the key. Of course I should have heard nothing of the Herberts in that quarter, but I asked the man fair and square how long they had left the house, and whether there had been any other tenants in the meanwhile. He looked at me queerly for a minute, and told me the Herberts had left immediately after the unpleasantness, as he called it, and since then the house had been empty. Mr. Villers paused for a moment. I have always been rather fond of going over empty houses. There's a sort of fascination about the desolate, empty rooms, with the nails sticking in the walls and the dust thick about the window-sills. But I didn't enjoy going over number 20 Paul Street. I had hardly put my foot inside the passage when I noticed a queer, heavy feeling about the air of the house. Of course, all empty houses are stuffy and so forth, but this was something quite different. I can't describe it to you, but it seemed to stop the breath. I went into the front room and the back room and the kitchens downstairs. They were all dirty and dusty enough, as you would expect, but there was something strange about them all. I couldn't define it to you. I only know it felt queer. It was one of the rooms on the first floor, though, and that was the worst. It was the largest room, and once on a time the paper must have been cheerful enough, but when I saw it, paint, paper, and everything were most doleful. But the room was full of horror. I felt my teeth grinding as I put my hand on the door, and when I went in I thought I should have fallen fainting to the floor. However, I pulled myself together and stood against the end wall, wondering what on earth there could be about the room to make my limbs tremble, and my heart beat as if I were in the house of death. In one corner there was a pile of newspapers littered on the floor, and I began looking at them. They were papers of 3 or 4 years ago, some of them half torn, and some crumpled as if they had been used for packing. I turned the whole pile over, and amongst them I found a curious drawing. I'll show it to you presently, but I couldn't stay in the room. I felt it was overpowering me. I was thankful to come out safe and sound into the open air. Well, that's not a good sign, you know. People stared at me as I walked along the street, and one man said I was drunk. I was staggering about from one side of the pavement to the other, and it was as much as I could do to take the key back to the agent and get home. I was in bed for a week, suffering from what my doctors called nervous shock and exhaustion. One of those days I was reading the evening paper and happened to notice a paragraph headed, "Starved to Death." It was the usual style of thing, a model lodging house in Marylebone, a door locked for several days, and a dead man in his chair when they broke in. The deceased, said the paragraph, was known as Charles Herbert, and is believed to have been once a prosperous country gentleman. His name was familiar to the public 3 years ago in connection with the mysterious death in Paul Street, Tottenham Court Road, the deceased being the tenant of the house number 20, in the area of which a gentleman of good position was found dead under circumstances not devoid of suspicion. A tragic ending, wasn't it? But after all, if what he told me was true, which I am sure it was, the man's life was all a tragedy, and a tragedy of a stranger sort than they put on the boards. "And this is the story, is it?" said Clark musingly. "Yes, this is the story." "Well, really, Villars, I scarcely know what to say about it. There are no doubt circumstances in the case which seem peculiar. The finding of the dead man in the area of Herbert's house, for instance, and the extraordinary opinion of the physician as to the cause of death. But after all, it is conceivable that the facts may be explained in a straightforward manner. As to your own sensations, when you went to see the house, I would suggest that they were due to a vivid imagination. Oh, come on. You must have been brooding in a semi-conscious way over what you had heard. I don't exactly see what more can be said or done in the matter. You evidently think there is a mystery of some kind, but Herbert is dead. Where then do you propose to look?" "I propose to look for the woman whom he married. She is the mystery." The two men sat silent by the fireside, Clark secretly congratulating himself on having successfully kept up the character of advocate of the commonplace, and Villars wrapped in his gloomy fancies. "I think I'll have a cigarette," he said at last, and put his hand in his pocket to feel for the cigarette case. "Ah!" he said, starting slightly. "I forgot I had something to show you. You remember my saying I had found a rather curious sketch among the pile of old newspapers in the house in Paul Street? Here it is." Villars drew out a small thin parcel from his pocket. It was covered with brown paper and secured with string, and the knots were troublesome. In spite of himself, Clark felt inquisitive. He bent forward on his chair as Villars painfully undid the string, and unfolded the outer covering. Inside was a second wrapping of tissue, and Villars took it off and handed the small piece of paper to Clark without a word. There was dead silence in the room for 5 minutes or more. The two men sat so still that they could hear the ticking of the tall, old-fashioned clock that stood outside in the hall. "Oh, thank you for the posture check, Julian20. Oof. Yeah, it's got to stretch my back a little bit. And in the mind of one of them, the slow monotony of sound woke up a far, far memory. He was looking intently at the small pen and ink sketch of the woman's head. It had evidently been drawn with great care, and by a true artist, for the woman's soul looked out of the eyes, and the lips were parted with a strange smile. Clark gazed still at the face. It brought to his memory one summer evening long, long ago. He saw again the long, lovely valley, the river winding between the hills, the meadows and the cornfields, the dull red sun and the cold white mist rising from the water. He heard a voice speaking to him across the waves of many years, and saying, "Clark, Mary will see the god Pan." And then he was standing in the grim room beside the doctor, listening to the heavy ticking of the clock, waiting and watching the figure lying on the green chair beneath the lamplight. Mary rose up, and he looked into his eyes. And he looked into her eyes, and his heart grew cold within him. "Who is this woman?" he said at last. His voice was dry and hoarse. "That is the woman who Herbert married." Clark looked again at the sketch. It was not Mary after all. There certainly was Mary's face, but there was something else. Something he had not seen on Mary's features when the white-clad girl entered the laboratory with the doctor, nor at her terrible awakening, nor when she lay grinning on the bed. Whatever it was, the glance that came from those eyes, the smile on the face, the smile on the full lips, or the expression on the whole face, Clark shuddered before it at his innermost soul, and thought unconsciously of Dr. Phillips' words, "The most vivid presentment of evil I have ever seen." He turned the paper over mechanically in his hand and glanced at the back. "Good God, Clark, what is the matter? You're as white as death." Villiers had started wildly from his chair as Clark fell back with a groan and let the paper drop from his hands. I don't feel very well, Villiers. I'm subject to these attacks. Pour me out a little wine. Thanks, that will do. I shall feel better in a few minutes." Villiers picked up the fallen sketch and turned it over as Clark had done. "You saw that?" he said. "That's how I identified it as being a portrait of Herbert's wife, or I should say his widow. How do you feel now?" "Better, thanks. It was only a passing faintness. I don't think I quite catch your meaning. What did you say enabled you to identify the picture?" "This word, Helen, was written on the back. Didn't I tell you her name was Helen?" "Yes, Helen Vaughn." Clark groaned. There could be no shadow of a doubt. "Now you agree with me," said Villiers, "that in the story I have told you tonight, and in the part this woman plays in it, there are some very strange points." "Yes, Villiers," Clark muttered. "It is a strange story indeed. A strange story indeed. You must give me time to think it over. You may be able to help you. I may be able to help you, or I may not. Must you be going now? Well, good night, Phyllis. Good night. Come and see me in the course of a week." Okay, my dear scholars, I'm going to give you a choice. We have 4 chapters left to read of this. Shall I finish this all tonight? Or shall I save this for another stream, which will happen most likely on Sunday? What say you, my dear scholars? Julian20 says save till Sunday. So we have one vote for save till Sunday. What say the rest of you? F2Ace, how's your voice feeling? My voice is okay. I've never I have never read this long before, but as you can probably tell, my pronunciations are starting to falter a little bit. What do you think, my dear scholars? I do these streams for you, so I like to give my dear scholars some uh, some choices in what I do, because otherwise I can keep reading. I'm at about 51% of this story. So what do you think, my dear scholars? We have one for resting. Okay. Then I will save it for next. Then I'll save it for Sunday. We are about halfway through, and I think that's a good stopping over point. It is exactly 8 chapters, so this should be good. So then, yes, I think Julian20. I've enjoyed the reading too. I'm a little bit surprised by it. I wasn't expecting exactly what I got, but there is this creeping horror in the story. Um, I'll give it to Manchin the fact that we don't get a direct line on what Helen has done to these people. Especially the bit with what she did to Rachel. With Rachel, we actually have probably the closest to an explicit idea, but only because given what we see Rachel's state is when she returned from the forest, we kind of know what had happened. And I can guess that's what shocked a lot of Victorian readers is Manchin is delving into some very he's being explicit without being explicit, if that makes sense. I know Lovecraft was said some great things about the great god Pan, although Lovecraft and who he is kind of, but it is a story which it's very different from most Victorian horror stories. I'll give it that. There isn't. It's very abstract in its horror. And that's almost worse because as we're gathering evidence, there's this creeping, abject terror that we're feeling with the characters as this all slowly dawns on them that this is something that is not of this world. But yes, we'll save the rest for Sunday. Um, for now, let's see who we can raid tonight. T-Waste, I appreciate that when done with a horse there. I appreciate it too. It's nice that it's not rushing things. All right, let's see. You know what? Let's raid Dear Sophia. She is reading Rinky Tink and Oz, which is one of my favorite Oz stories. So we will raid her for tonight. But for now, my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Till we meet each other again at the study. Take care, and I shall see you next time. Till then, farewell and bye bye.